The third book of the Torah is known as Vayikra. It's only referred to as that because it begins, God called to Moshe. However, in the Talmud, the third book is referred to as Torah's Kohanim, the laws which pertain to Kohanim, to the priests. They are the only ones who are qualified to do the service in the Mishkan, ultimately in the temple, the Hamikdash. It's the law which pertains to the sacrifices, what species qualify, what exactly is the service, how's the service done, where's the service done, which Kohen qualifies, if he's blemished, if the animal is blemished, all these various laws. That's what this book discusses. And there was called Torah's Kohanim. It's the Torah which pertains to the Kohanim, all the aspects of their lives regarding laws of contamination. The Kohen's not permitted to contaminate himself, to the remains of an ordinary person. If it's the seven closest relatives, yes. If it's the high priest, who are they permitted to marry? All this is contained within this book. It's the law which pertains to the priests. But first and foremost, the value of the Kohen is that he is the officiant of God. He is the one who is so-called the representative of the Jewish people. When one has to bring a sacrifice, he represents us. He's the one qualified who could actually be involved in officiating in this particular service. The service of the sacrifices, service in the temple, whether it's on a communal level or whether it's on a private level. There were communal offerings brought every day. And that we discussed the concept of the matzah shekel, that every Jew above the age of 20, which was the age of conscription, had to give a half a silver coin to purchase the communal offerings. Meaning the communal offerings was purchased from the proceeds of every Jew who participated in the matzah shekel and the half a silver coin. Those are communal offerings. Then we speak about private offerings. Person wants to voluntarily bring a peace offering, a burnt offering. He's able to. Then you have obligatory offerings, a sin offering, a guilt offering, meal offerings. We speak about the Incense Altar, which is a communal offering, which is brought on the inner altar, which is in the covered sanctuary. It was known as Mizbach Hazov, the golden altar. That's what it was. That's all discussed in this book. So the first Ramban, the first piece which Nachmanides writes on this book, the book of Torah's Kohanim, he cites a Moreh Nevuchim. Moreh Nevuchim was authored by the Rambam. It's known as the Guide for the Perplexed. It initially was written in Arabic. Unfortunately, for people who were not really learned, they didn't have the background, and he presents all the mitzvahs of the Torah to give some rational understanding why they should participate in all the 613 precepts of the Torah. And it's a guide for the perplexed, those who are confused, who don't have sufficient background. It's provided, gives them an entry point, how they could see value in serving God, because they'll understand the value of the positive and the negative commandment. So Rambam writes in the Guide for the Perplexed, what is the concept of sacrifices? Why does God allow sacrifices? So he explains that a human being very often has a need to be subservient to a higher power and to serve that higher power. And the expression of that subservience comes through sacrifice. I mean, we bring an animal as a sacrifice, which is the equivalent, the concept means that I am willing to give my life for you, whatever that power may be, and therefore I bring the animal in my place. In terms of the true pagans, they had what they called human sacrifice. They would sacrifice their child to the deity that they believed in, that was a level of selfless dedication to that deity they believed in. They would even bring human sacrifice. Human sacrifice, according to Judaism, forbidden. It's considered murder. You're not permitted to bring a human sacrifice. But God allows, if you want to bring a voluntary sacrifice of certain species, you can. So he says that it's to allow the person to have an expression, an outlet, an avenue to express that need to be subservient to a higher power. Because if not, if you wouldn't have a permitted outlet for this, a person ultimately would gravitate to paganism. He would serve other powers. So God says, you are allowed to bring it for me, so the Jew should not veer towards other beliefs and serve other deities. That's the Rambam in God for Perplexed. Nachmanides, when he hears this, he cites it, he says, definitely 100% incorrect. That is definitely not what the concept of sacrifices are. That's not the concept of what it's all about, but rather, and he rejects it out of hand immediately, the concept of sacrifices is, a sacrifice is called korban. So most people think, in Hebrew, the word karov means to bring close. That if you want to get close to God, you bring a sacrifice, which is the truth. But the reason why it's called korban is because it coalesces all the forces that are activated through the service. Meaning, we studied many times, the world in its physical state only because God unleashes endless forces which allow those forces to manifest themselves in the physicality of the world. That's how things come about. How do we activate forces of mercy, of blessing? We do mitzvahs. We do God's will. We serve God at a special level. There's our investment through our choices. If you bring the sacrifice as prescribed by the Torah, it's mekari v'sakochos. It goes and brings those powers closer and it coalesces them that we should be beneficiaries of those energies which the sacrifice activates and releases. That's the concept of sacrifice. That's the Ramban. Okay. So Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk explains that the Ramban, Nachmanides misunderstood the Rambam. Although the Rambam does write that in Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam is not speaking about sacrifices in the Mishkan. He's not speaking about sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple. Now, before the Mishkan was built, or after we had gone into Canaan, during the conquest times, the Jew would want to build his own altar in his backyard, on his rooftop. He was permitted to bring his own personal sacrifice. That's called bama. Bama means the elevated location. You build an elevated location, and you bring that sacrifice. In the context of out of the Mishkan, out of the temple, during this period of time, the one who officiates doesn't even have to be a Kohen. Even an ordinary Jew is able to officiate, as long as you follow the prescription of what services. Now, why did God allow that? So that, Rameir Simcha explains, that's the Rambam in God for Perplexed. That since one doesn't have the Mishkan available, you don't have a location where you could serve God, and a person has a need to express that subservience to a higher power, that is the outlet. Because if he would not have that outlet, a person would gravitate towards idolatry to serve some other power. So that is to avoid that from happening. But the value of that korban is purely an act of what? Of service. What does it generate? Doesn't generate very much. Why? Because when you brought a sacrifice in the Mishkan, the Torah says continuously, it's Lifnei Hashem. In the Mishkan, God's presence dwelt there. In the Holy of Holies, God's presence was there. God had descended to the terrestrial level in that location, which was the concept of creation pre-sin of Adam. And that is, what is that location? That's what that location is. So when you bring a sacrifice, which is called Korban, and that location, which is Lifnei Hashem, before God, you activate these unlimited forces, because that service is done before the Shekhinah. It's being done in the presence of the divine presence. Because it's done in the divine presence, it coalesces those forces. There was a time you were not permitted to bring that personal sacrifice on your personal altar. If you wanted to bring it, it had to be brought in the Mishkan. Once we built the Beis HaMikdash, once the temple was built based on verses, you're not permitted to build your own, even after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So we don't have that outlet any longer. Once you've come to the Menucha, to the final resting place, you can no longer build your own sacrifice. It can only be brought on the Temple Mount itself. So Rav Meir Simcha differentiates. Rambam in Guide for the Perplexed is speaking about the Bama, the personal altar you build, which was only during a very specific period of time. It was for that purpose. But the animal, the sacrifice that's brought in the Mishkan or in the temple, which is Lifnei Hashem, Rambam concurs 100% with Nachmanides that the purpose is, the concept is L'karev hakochos, to coalesce these energies to bring about the end result. That's Rav Meir Simcha. If you fast forward to the portion of Balak, the Jews are traveling, and we're nearing the 40th year in the desert. And we come near Midian, the Midianites, Moab. And Balak, the king of Moab, he commissions Bilam, who's the prophet of the nations, to curse the Jewish people. And the curse of Bilam, because he was a prophet of God, was the equivalent of the kiss of death. And Balak commissioned him, says he'll pay him anything, because he was concerned that if the Jewish people come, they will actually destroy his people. They will take over that whole area. So he says to Bilam, whatever you want, I'm willing to pay. Bilam comes, and the Navi says, during this period of time, God did righteousness with the Jewish people. Every day, there's a moment of the wrath of God. And if Bilam would have cursed the Jews during that moment, the Jews would have been destroyed. But God did not allow himself, even for that moment, to express his wrath. Therefore, the curse of Bilam fell on deaf ears for that reason. So Bilam comes to Balak, and he plays the role that God will do anything he wants, which ultimately revealed itself not to be the case. And he tells Balak, who's the king of Moab, to build 7 altars and bring so many sacrifices. And guess what? God does not respond. God does not allow Bilam to curse the Jewish people. Not only does not allow to curse me, he forces him to bless the Jewish people. That's the narrative of the story of Bilam. But in that narrative, Bilam says to God, I don't understand. The patriarchs themselves, we find each one brought one sacrifice, and yet they were esteemed and revered by you, and you did whatever they wanted. Here, I bring endless sacrifices for you. Those sacrifices were brought for God. They weren't brought for some deity, and yet you don't respond. I don't understand. What didn't Bilam get? What didn't he understand? We're saying now, whatever Balak built under the instruction of Bilam, what was the value of those altars? It was like building an altar out in the field. That's the expression of subservience. Does it activate forces? Does it coalesce forces? Does nothing. It's purely an act of subservience. That's all it is. The Mishkan, when you brought that carbon, because it's Lefnei Hashem, because God's presence is there, it activates those forces. It coalesces those forces. Okay? Now let's talk about the patriarchs. Before the Mishkan was built, where was God's presence in this existence? Wherever the patriarchs were, that's where God's presence was. So when Avram brought that one carbon, the one sacrifice, what was the context of that sacrifice? Lefnei Hashem. Because since wherever Avram was, that's exactly where the divine presence was, that's no less than bringing the carbon sacrifice in the Mishkan, in the temple. So what was the effect? What were the ramifications? Unlimited. And when Yitzchak brought the carbon, Yitzchak also is the domicile for what? For the divine presence. Yaakov was the domicile for the divine presence. So when each of them brought even one carbon, it had infinite value versus Bilam. He could have brought thousands. Because we're talking about quantitative and action going through a mundane physical act versus something which takes on a spiritual dimension because it's directly in the presence of God. They're worlds apart. They're not comparable whatsoever. Bilam did not understand this. He thought if he's a prophet of God, whatever he does is before God, but that's not the case. God is there and he's over here. With the Jewish people, we brought the carbon, the sacrifice in the Mishkan. It was literally in the presence of God. The Avos HaKadoshim, the holy patriarchs, when they brought their sacrifices, even though it was only one, but the one in what was its context? Before God, therefore, is able to activate these unlimited forces, and God valued for that reason to a level which was nothing comparable to that level. There's something I once said in the name of Rav Chaim Volozhiner in his commentary on Pirkei Avos. The commentary is known as Ruach Chaim, the spirit of life. And he writes over there on the Mishnah, the world stands on three principles: Torah, Avod, and Gemilas Chasodim. The study of Torah, the service of God, which is either sacrifices or tefillah, and acts of loving kindness. The world stands on three principles. So we ask a question, we find that each of the three patriarchs actually demonstrated one of the attributes of God in an overwhelming level. Avram is known as the pillar of loving kindness. Chesed, he had a home, 4 entrances, attended to all the needs of every wayfarer, day and night. The Gemara tells us that Avram's meal that he fed the angels, which he didn't know they were angels, was like the banquet of King Solomon at the height of his power. That was his level of hospitality. Avram was the height, the epitome of loving kindness. Yitzchak, being the object of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, he represents the most exacting level of service of God. Yaakov, who is Yaakov Ishtami Yoshev Oholim, he's the man of the tent who studies Torah. He represents Torah. So Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak is Avoda, and Yaakov is Torah. Yaakov Ishtami Yoshev Oholim, he's the man of the tent of Torah. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner asks, if that's the case, why did Judah the prince, Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, who's the redactor of the oral law, who authored the Mishnah, why is the sequence of these variables, which the world stands on, that he begin with Torah? He should have begun Gemilas Chasodim, Avoda, and Torah. The world stands on 3 principles, and that's sequentially the order. Avram is Gemilas Chasodim, Gemilas Chesed, Yitzchak is Avoda, and Yaakov is Torah. but yet he has to order and burn it. It begins with Torah. Why? So Chaim Voloshin explains, pre-Sinai, if a person wanted to bring a sacrifice for God, you build an altar anywhere and you bring the sacrifice. And that's called serving God. That's an act of subservience to God, dedication to God. Fast forward, post-Sinai. If you bring the sacrifice on your own personal altar, not the Mishkan, what is the liability? For slaughtering it as a sacrifice or burning it as a sacrifice, the liability is spiritual excision. So something pre-Sinai, which was considered admirable, subservient, mitzvah, post-Sinai is considered a grave sin that one is liable for spiritual excision. Pre-Sinai, a person wanted to lend money with interest. Even it was initiated by the lender, not by the borrower. It's an act of loving kindness. I'm providing with means for whatever it is, to borrow for living, for investment, whatever it may be. And whatever interest you charge is 100% permitted. Post-Sinai, the Torah does not allow one to be a usurer. The lender cannot lend based on interest, and even if it's initiated by the borrower, he wants to pay the interest, you're not permitted to take it. Torah violation. So something that was admirable as chesed, as loving kindness, post-Sinai, is considered detriment. So what determines whether it is or whether it's not? The question is, what comes first? The world stands on three principles. Torah. First, you have to know what the Torah says. The Torah will tell you what is and what's not. What's loving kindness? What is service of Hashem? You want to know? Study the Torah. You study the Torah, now you understand what avod is. It's only in the Mishkan, not on a private altar. What is chesed? That's lending interest-free. Although your intention is to do loving kindness to help a person, there's a restriction. Why? Because the Torah says you're not permitted to. There are many things we don't understand why. Because when you lend your brother, you lend him gratis. You lend them without interest. You're not permitted. So that's the reason why the Torah precedes the Avodah and the Gemilas Chasodim. Although sequentially speaking, Yaakov was the last of the patriarchs who personifies Torah itself for that reason. I'd said the Talmud tells us in two locations, when a child begins speaking, you have to teach him certain verses in the Torah. What's the first verse you teach the child? It's a verse in the Torah. Torah tziva lanu Moshe barashah kilas Yaakov. The Torah was commanded to us by Moshe. It is the heritage of the congregation of Jacob. That's the first pasuk, verse you teach a child when he begins speaking. What is the second verse you teach the child? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elkeinu Hashem Echad. Unity of God. You realize the child is only beginning to speak. He has no understanding of what either verse means. But nevertheless, to embed it into his mind, to use that faculty of speech, to be invested in this, first the verse is Torah tziva lanu Moshe b'rosh kilos Yaakov, then Shema Yisrael. So I ask the question. We know Shema Yisrael, declaring your belief in God, is unity. That's the fundamental. That is the foundation for Judaism. That's what it's about. And after you believe in the unity of God, we speak about studying Torah. He is the one who commanded us to study Torah, to observe his mitzvos, positive, negative. So if that's the case, the first verse you should teach your child is Torah tziva lanu, it should be Shema Yisrael. Hashem Elkei Hashem Echad, that's the first verse. And the second is Torah tziva lanu Moshe. But yet the Talmud says the other way. The first verse you teach him is Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Everything's tradition. Going back to Moshe. And then we talk about the detail of Shema. As important as Shema may be, it's the fundamental of Jewish belief, the unity of God. Nevertheless, that's not the first verse he teaches. The question is why. So we said in the name of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, because the first verse he teaches him is Torah Tzivah Lanu Moshe. What is the source and the basis for all belief, for any function of a Jew? How to serve God. Torah Tzivah Lanu Moshe Shakilas Yaakov. You have that text, you know exactly where to go. Now, where do I go? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokei Hashem Echad. That's the text. But what's the fundamental? The fundamental is Torah. First, you have to know what the Torah says. After you know what the Torah says, then we speak about details. The application of what's contained within that Torah itself. Therefore, the first verse you teach the child is Torah Tzivah Lanu Moshe, and the second is Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, for that reason. The Midrash at the beginning of the Sefer Vayikra, there's a pasuk in Tehillim, which the Gemara in Shabbos regarding the receiving Torah at Sinai quotes this pasuk. Baruch Hu Hashem Alochav, the angels bless God, and who are they? Giborei Koach, those who are powerful with strength. Osi Dvaro, they do his word. Lishmo b'kol Dvaro, to listen to the sound of his voice, to hear his voice. Who are the Giborei Koach, the powerful ones? The one who firstly, Osi Dvaro, they do his will. Lishmoa b'kol Dvaro, to listen to all that he says. So of course, the Talmud in Shabbos tells us the Jewish people at Sinai, not only did we accept the Torah that God offered us, the context in which we accepted was we accepted unequivocally. We said, Naaseh v'nishma. We first said we will do, although we didn't know the extent of that obligation, we accepted wholeheartedly. And we just said, God, just tell us now what. We accept, we will do your will regardless of whatever it is. Just tell us what to do. So that's Naaseh v'nishma. Angels, how do they function? They're they're always ready to do. They just need the charge. So far, first they're ready to do, and that's what the angels created for, to do the will of God. And then God gives them the charge and to carry it out. So the angel is always Naaseh v'nishma. First, he's ready to go. He just has to be given the direction, the directive, what to do. Klal Yisrael at Sinai, we will Giborei Koach. You know what it means to put yourself in the position, not knowing the extent of your obligation? You're dedicating your whole physicality, all your creativity, your mind, everything to God. Is there any room left for yourself? We said, Naaseh v'nishma. Regardless of what it is, we embrace it, we accept it. And God said, it's fine. But to be able to do that, you have to be a Gibor Koach. Gibor means powerful with strength. We're talking about inner strength, not physical strength. There's a biography that came out maybe 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. It's on Rav Baruch Ber Leibowitz, the Kamenetz Rosh Yeshiva. It was a town in Belarus. It was called Kamenetz, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva of this yeshiva. Had a few hundred students, and he mentored the best of Europe. He himself was the closest student of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, of Baruch Ber Leibowitz. And the book that's written is called Domer L'Malach Hashem Tzvados. He has a semblance of an angel, of a holy angel, a godly angel. So the author who had written his biography, in the introduction, he explains why did he choose this title. And he explains, he quotes this verse, Baruch Hashem Alochav. God blessed his angels. What is an angel? Osed Dvoro, doing Lishmoa B'Kol Hashem. First they do, then they listen. Because they're ready to do regardless of whatever the extent of their investment may be. So he says, he explains, when you study yeshiva, and you're a shiva, all you study and you invest in what? In the public lectures that you have to teach the students. But other areas of Torah, which are not being studied in yeshiva, very often the Rosh Yeshiva doesn't have time for that because he's fully invested in the students. So over there he writes, Reb Baruch Ber and his son spent 2 years in New York City, or in the United States, the Eastern Seaboard, raising money for the Commons Yeshiva in Europe. And when he was with his son-in-law in the United States, he learned 2 tractates that he did not learn in Europe. They were tractates regarding kosher, which he didn't do in Europe. That he didn't learn. So he explains why. Because in Europe, where the yeshiva is, all he is dedicated only to that yeshiva. It's Osed Dvoro. He has to fulfill his responsibility. Therefore, I have to be current on everything which pertains to you people. What about myself? When you're committed to the public, there's no yourself. There's only the public. Therefore, as a result of that, he didn't study these tractates. And he's like a malach. A malach only does what he's supposed to do. The will of God. Will of God is, I have a charge, I fulfill that. Nothing outside of that. No infringement on that. Now that he was in the United States 2 years, he wasn't teaching students. He was here fundraising. So in the spare time he had that he was able to learn, he learned those things that he didn't learn in Europe in depth. Same idea. But why they call Gibar Koach? To make that level of commitment, not knowing where it's going, to what degree am I tying myself up? And to have that level of trust and faith in God and say, whatever it is, I accept. That level of acceptance is worth everything in the world. That's the ultimate. That's Gori Koach Osed Dvaro. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafko says, who are these people who are Gibori Koach, and it has relevance to right now? Elu Shomri Shviyas. These are the keepers of the sabbatical year in Israel. They don't work the land, no agricultural involvement, no reaping, no harvesting, no planting for a year, for the 7th year. Elu Shomri, those are the ones who observe the Shviyas, the sabbatical year. V'lomen Nikras Shmom, why they called Gibor Koch? What enormous power does it take? So it says, Roas Shesadeo Mufkeres Vilonos Mufkorim. Person has a field, he has orchards, he has vineyards, and all of a sudden, during the sabbatical year, everything becomes ownerless. That means everyone has a right to come to your field and pick and take whatever they want. Before us, all the fences are breached. Fences keep people out. During this year, everybody has a right to everybody's property. The Roa Peirosov Nechonim. Here, his sweat and blood, his toil. 7th year comes, he sees his handiwork being devoured by people. The Kovesh Yitzro of Einem Medaber. And he suppresses his inclination, remains silent, doesn't say a word. V'shon Rabbeinu, and we learned the Pirkei Avos, Ezeu Gibor HaKovish Yitzro. Who is the powerful one? The one who is able to suppress his inclination. Here I created all this. Now you see him being devoured. It takes unusual level of strength to be able to deal with that. Because the effort that went in there, that this is his creation, and to see it just go up and disappear because people are eating it, to be able to tolerate that, you have to be Gibor Koach. Okay? So I asked the question. The Torah tells us that if a person observes the Shemitah, the yield of the 6th year will be the equivalent of 3-year yield. It'll cover you for the 6th, 7th, 8th. 3 years. You'll have a 3-year bumper crop in the 6th year, and it's always proven out. So if that's the case, why is a person observe Shemitah, this battle year, why is he called Gibor Koach? He has enormous strength, because the one who's truly powerful is the one who's able to suppress his inclination. But the Torah says, if you observe the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, the 6th year will be converted to 3 years worth of produce. So if that's the case, why is it such a challenge? So you see the fences coming down. You see people eating, and it doesn't make a difference to you. Why is that called Gibor Koach? We know that the ego in a human being plays an overwhelming role. And that's what drives us. And that's what dictates our lives very often. Even when it's under control and you're able to somehow rein in on it, it's a major force within whatever you do in life, within your decision process, where you want to put your ability. It's called evil inclination. Okay? The Torah says, if you observe the Shemitah, you don't work the land in the 7th year and bring in the harvest in the 8th year, you leave it to be ownless, I will guarantee you unlimited blessing, unlimited bracha. So the question is, if you're being reimbursed and compensated for any fruit they take, so why is it such a difficult challenge? So it says, because you see your fruits are being eaten, you see your fences are coming down, and everything's being scavenged. But you're getting paid. What difference does it make? The two things, everything, as they say, is not money. What about the sense of my human dignity? I toil for this. How do I allow you to eat? It goes against the grain. Because it goes against the grain. And despite that, you're able to suppress it. Because that's what God says. This Ezo Gibor Akovish Yisro. Who is the strong one? The one who can suppress his inclination to allow this to go on before his eyes. That's what it's about. That's meeting the challenge. So what I said was, if the ego is essential in a person's life, the sabbatical year is anybody who wants to come in my field and take any amount of produce he wants, he has a right to do that. Despite the fact that I created that. For a person to see his efforts going up in smoke, being eaten by anyone, enemy, friend, whoever it may be, they have a right to go into the field because the produce is ownerless. So as they say, it's not the money, it's the principle. You hear that too often. It's the principle, it's not the money. It's what this represents. This represents everything who I am. By them destroying it, although you compensate me, but by them not valuing me and needing to ask permission to take, my essence is compromised. What's your essence? Your essence is your ego. That's what happens. Therefore, God says, I'll make it up for you. And that's a blessing. So even though it's Vitzivisis Berchosi, I will command my blessing, 3 years, you'll have a bumper crop. It's not the bumper crop. It's that people will be able to lord over my asset as if it's theirs, which it's not theirs. And I can't tolerate it for that reason. The Talmud tells us a very interesting principle. There's a case discussed in the Mishnah. Person's a custodian and is given produce to watch, whether it's grain, produce, other things. And as he has it, there's a certain degree of spoilage. Starts spoiling. Is he permitted to sell it off for its cash value and hold the cash for the owner? And if he does that, the value of the produce is going to retain most of its value. But if he allows it to deteriorate and at a later date, the owner gets it back, he's only getting back 60% of his value. But if the custodian would sell it, he's getting back nearly 100% of his value. But yet, the custodian is still not permitted to sell it. Why? So the Talmud tells us there's a concept that something that you created, something that came through your effort and your handiwork, is more endeared to the person than something of greater value. Like they say in English, it's not all money. It's something I created. And Rashi explains in his commentary, anything we toil, anything we invest our lives in, that becomes special to us. As a result of that, since this produce was given to him by a farmer, and it was his efforts, whether it's the seeding, the harvesting, the threshing, only came due to his efforts, therefore, the end result is more dear to the person. So he doesn't want you just to give it away. So when he sees the fences coming down and everybody's acting as if they're a proprietor, where it's something he created, it's something he can't tolerate. And if he could tolerate it, he's a gibor, because he's able to suppress his desire. So I always say, a person raises a child. And the amount of effort that's needed to raise a child is not to be described on many levels. And you raise that child. As a result of raising the child and caring for the child, what's your level of investment in that child? That investment is what? It's a tremendous investment. As a result of that, because the toil is so overwhelming, automatically there's a special endearment of that child to the parent. Okay, I think today we're going to stop here and I'll entertain questions.